5 years. That was how long Meredith Crane endured it before anyone outside those walls knew what was happening inside them. 5 years of locked doors and quiet bruises, of excuses whispered to the preacher's wife on Sunday mornings. She tripped on the porch step. She burned her wrist on the stove. She's been so clumsy lately. 5 years of a town that saw and looked away, because the man who owned the biggest parcel of land north of the river was not a man you crossed. Not in Harrow Bend, Kansas. Not in 1881. His name was Preston Hale. He was 43 years old, well-dressed, well-spoken, and respected by every merchant on Main Street. He gave generously to the church. He tipped his hat to widows. He kept his cruelty so neatly inside his own four walls that most people in town had convinced themselves it wasn't cruelty at all. Just a man with a strong temper and a wife who didn't know how to keep herself out of the way of it. Meredith had been 22 when she married him. She'd been a farmer's daughter from outside of Wichita, with nothing to her name but a quick mind, steady hands, and the kind of quiet beauty that men like Preston Hale noticed from across a church hall. Her father had approved the match. Her mother had sewn her wedding dress from fabric ordered out of a catalog. Everyone had smiled. She stopped smiling about 3 weeks into the marriage. The first time, he said it was an accident. His hand came across her face in the kitchen over a pot of coffee that had gone cold, and he stood over her on the floor and said, with perfect calm, that she had startled him. That was all, she had startled him. She lay there on the planked floor with her ears ringing, and told herself he was right. She must have startled him. By the second year, she had stopped making excuses for him in her own mind. She had simply accepted it as the shape of her life. She woke up each morning calculating his mood before she calculated anything else. She studied the set of his shoulders at the breakfast table, the way a sailor studies the sky. Tight means stay quiet. Loose means maybe today will be all right. She learned to move through her own home like smoke, present but not there, visible but not enough to catch. She had no children. She thanked God for that every day. She had tried once, early on, to speak to the sheriff about what was happening, a man named Graft, red-faced and slow-moving, who had been drinking whiskey with Preston on Friday evenings for 15 years. He had looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but lived in the exact middle ground between the two, and told her that what went on between a husband and his wife was between a husband and his wife. Then he'd stood up and put on his hat. She did not try again. The women in town were not unkind, exactly. Mrs. Devlin at the dry goods store had pressed her hand once, quickly, when no one was looking, and said nothing at all. Just that small pressure of fingers, there and gone, like a bird landing on a fence post and lifting again. Meredith had held on to that moment for months afterward. It was the most honest thing anyone had given her in years, but holding on to a moment wasn't the same as having a way out. And Meredith, in those years, could see no way out at all. The winter of her 5th year was the worst. Something had shifted in Preston by then. Some restraint he had kept, whether from reputation or calculation, had begun to fray. He stopped being careful. He stopped caring whether the marks showed. There was a week in November when she didn't leave the house at all, not because he'd locked her in, but because she couldn't. Her left eye had swollen shut. Her ribs ached when she breathed. She lay on top of the bed covers in the room, across from the one they shared, and stared at the ceiling and thought about the river. It wasn't the first time she'd thought about it, but it was the first time the thought had felt less like despair and more like simple mathematics. A problem with a solution. She was not frightened by the thought, and that frightened her more than anything else had in 5 years. She made herself get up. She walked to the window. Outside, the fields were brown and frozen, the sky the color of old tin. A crow sat on the fence post at the edge of the yard, watching nothing in particular, and then opened its wings and was gone. She watched the empty fence post for a long time. He came through Harrow Bend on a Tuesday in late November, the day after the first real snow. Nobody knew where he was from. That was the thing people would say later, talking about it in the way small towns talk about things they don't fully understand, that nobody knew where he was from, or where he was going, or what his business was in a town like Harrow Bend. He had ridden in from the North Trail on a gray mule with another mule loaded behind him, and he'd tied both animals at the post outside Delmer's feed and gone in to buy a bag of oats and a block of salt, and that should have been the end of it. His name was Amos Thorne. He was not a young man. Somewhere in the middle of his 40s, though the outdoors had put 10 years on his face in a way that made it hard to be certain. He was large in the way that men who've spent their lives in physical labor are large. Not for show, not cultivated, just the result of years of carrying and chopping and hauling and surviving. He wore a coat made from the hide of something that might have been a bear, and a hat that had seen better decades. And he had the unhurried quality of a man who had long ago made his peace with the fact that time moves at the same speed regardless of how you feel about it. He did not come to Harrow Bend to be anyone's hero. He came for oats. What happened was this. He was loading his purchase onto the second mule when Preston Hale came down the street with Meredith 2 steps behind him, and he stopped paying attention to the buckle he'd been threading and paid attention instead to what he was seeing. People in town would say later that they hadn't noticed anything unusual, that it had looked, from the outside, like a husband and wife running an errand. Preston walked ahead. Meredith followed. That was normal enough. What they said they hadn't noticed was the way she moved, that particular quality of careful, that slightly too controlled placement of each step that belonged to a person who has learned to make themselves as small and predictable as possible. Amos Thorne noticed it. He noticed it the way a man who has spent years in the wilderness notices the way a deer moves when it scents something it cannot yet see. Not fear exactly, something older than fear, something that had already accepted the worst and was now simply trying to navigate it. He watched. Preston spoke to someone outside the bank and laughed his broad, comfortable laugh, and Meredith stood half a step behind his left shoulder, with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the ground, and Amos Thorne finished threading his buckle and did not get back on his mule. He went to the hotel instead. He paid for one night. He saw her again the next morning at the well at the south end of town, where residents who didn't have a pump on their property came to draw water. It was early, before 7, the sky still more gray than blue, the snow from the day before sitting hard and bright on everything. She was alone. He waited until she had filled her first bucket before he approached, and when he did, he kept his distance, and his hands visible, and his voice at the level of a man saying nothing important. "Morning," he said. She looked up. Her eyes, what he could see of them, since she'd pulled her collar up and her hat down against the cold, were careful, assessing, used to measuring threat before anything else. "Morning," she said back. Nothing more. He picked up the handle of the second bucket she'd set down and held it toward her, meaning to offer help without presuming to give it. She looked at the bucket. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Not softening exactly, but a fractional easing of the vigilance. The way a lock doesn't open, but just gives slightly when the right pressure is applied. "Thank you," she said, and took the handle. That was all. She walked back up the road. He watched her go and thought about what he'd noticed. The way she had flinched, very slightly, when he'd moved to pick up the bucket. Not at him specifically, at the movement itself. The automatic preparation for impact that the body learns when impact has become routine. He had seen it before. He knew what it was. He stayed 2 more days. He ate at the boarding house and asked no questions, and said little enough that people had no particular reason to wonder about him. He watched Preston Hale the way he'd watched other things in his life. Patiently, without revealing that he was watching, the way you watch a storm coming in from the west, and calculate what it means to be in the open. On the 3rd morning, he was in the feed store when he heard it. The shop was empty except for old Delmer behind the counter, half asleep over his ledger, When the sound came from the house behind the store, not loud, not the kind of sound that announces itself, just a single low cry, quickly muffled. The kind of sound a person makes when they've learned that sounds don't help and might make things worse, but something has forced it out anyway. Delmer did not look up from his ledger. Amos Thorne set down the tin of tobacco he'd been looking at and walked out the front door and around the side of the building without hurrying, because hurrying announced your intentions, and he did not want Preston Hale to have time to prepare for his. He didn't knock. The door was unlocked. People in small towns in Kansas didn't generally lock their doors in the middle of the day, and he opened it and stepped inside. Preston was in the kitchen. Meredith was on the floor by the table. One of the chairs had been knocked sideways. A tin cup lay on its side near the stove, still rolling. Preston turned around. He was a tall man, Preston Hale, and he had the look of someone who had never once in his life expected to be interrupted. He stared at Amos Thorne in his kitchen for a full 3 seconds, with an expression that moved through surprise, confusion, and arrived at outrage. "Who in hell are you?" he said. Amos looked at Meredith on the floor. Then he looked at Preston. "I'm the man standing in your kitchen," he said. "That's enough for right now." What happened in the next 4 minutes was not something that Amos Thorne would describe, later, with any particular satisfaction. He did not go into the house with satisfaction in mind. He went in because a woman was on a kitchen floor and a door was unlocked, and the arithmetic of it was simple. Preston Hale was a large man and a confident one, and confident men who have spent years imposing their will on someone smaller are sometimes surprised to find themselves facing something they cannot intimidate. The surprise, in Amos Thorne's experience, never lasted long. The fight lasted less time than that. He did not kill Preston Hale. He had considered it, in the short and clinical way he considered necessary things, and decided against it, not from mercy, but because a dead man in a kitchen with a stranger standing over him and a wife on the floor had a particular kind of story attached to it, and it was not a story that would end well for Meredith. What he did was make very certain that Preston Hale understood, in the most physical and unambiguous terms available, that the arrangement that had existed in this house for the past 5 years had reached its conclusion. When it was done, he crouched down next to Meredith. She was watching him. Her eyes were clear, not vacant, not shocked into blankness, but present and watchful and taking in everything, in the way of a person who has survived by paying close attention. "Can you walk?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Then walk," he said, and stood up and offered his hand. She took a coat from the hook by the door and nothing else. He noticed that, didn't comment on it. They walked out of the house and down the street in the cold morning air. And people who saw them from the windows of the dry goods store and the barber shop and the land office watched them go, and none of them came out to ask what had happened or where they were going. And Amos Thorne felt, though he said nothing about it, the same low contempt for them that he had felt when old Delmer had not looked up from his ledger. He had 2 mules. He gave her the better one. She could ride. That surprised him slightly, though he didn't know why it should have. Women in Kansas knew how to do most things, by necessity. She settled into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd grown up on horseback, which she had, before her life narrowed down to those 4 walls and Preston Hale's moods. They rode north, because north was the direction he'd been going before he'd stopped in Harrow Bend for oats. She did not speak much the first day. He did not require it. They rode through the snow-covered fields and the bare-limbed cottonwood stands and the long gray afternoon, and he set camp when the light began to fail and built a fire and made coffee and beans, and she sat across from him with her hands around her tin cup and looked into the fire, and he left her to it. The second morning she said, without preamble, "Where are you going?" "North," he said. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. It was not self-pity, it was information, delivered plainly. He considered this. "You have somewhere not to go," he said. "That's a start." She looked at him. Something in her face rearranged itself, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the memory of it. "My name is Meredith," she said. "Amos," he said. They rode north. His place was 6 days out, up into the hill country where the cedars grew thick, and the wind came down from the upper elevations with a seriousness of purpose. It wasn't much, a cabin he'd built himself over 2 summers, chinked tight against the cold, with a stone fireplace lit that drew well and a root cellar sunk into the hillside behind the woodpile. It was clean, though, orderly, the home of a person who lived alone by choice and had made peace with the requirements of that choice. She stood in the doorway the first evening and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "It's not much," he said, because he believed in accurate representations. "It's quiet," she said. She stayed. There is a particular kind of healing that has no drama to it. Nobody writes songs about it. It doesn't announce itself. It is simply the slow relearning of what it means to be safe, the gradual unwinding of a vigilance that has been held so long it has become indistinguishable from the self. It happens in small moments. The first morning she woke up, without calculating someone else's mood before her own. The first time she dropped a tin cup on the stone floor, and he looked up from the harness he was mending, and said nothing at all. The first time she laughed, actually laughed, at something he said. It surprised her, the sound of it, as if she'd reached into a coat pocket and found something she'd given up looking for. He taught her to trap, because it was useful and because she asked. She already knew how to shoot. Her father had seen to that, but there was a difference between shooting and knowing how to read the land, how to understand what moved through it and why and when. He showed her how to read sign in the snow, how to set a line, how to skin and dress what she caught. She was a fast learner. He told her so. She received the information with the slightly stunned expression of a person who hasn't heard a straightforward compliment in years and isn't immediately sure what to do with it. They did not speak much about Harrow Bend. He did not ask. She did not offer. Once, in the long evenings by the fire, she said, "I keep thinking someone will come." And he said, "Maybe," and she said, "Does that worry you?" And he looked up from the knife he was sharpening and said, "No," in a tone that made the subject feel finished, and she believed him, and the subject was finished. But she was right that someone would come. It was 6 weeks after they had arrived when the rider appeared on the trail below the cabin. Amos saw him first, from the tree line above, where he'd been checking his upper trap line. He stood very still in the cedars and watched. The rider was moving carefully, not the careful of a man unfamiliar with rough country, but the careful of a man who was looking for something and didn't want to announce it. He had the lean, purposeful quality of a professional, and he wore a long coat despite the cold that Amos recognized as the kind of coat designed to make a particular kind of equipment less visible, a hired man. Preston Hale's reach, it appeared, was longer than his legs. Amos came down out of the tree line and circled behind the cabin and came in through the back, and Meredith was already at the window. "I see him," she said. He looked at her. There was no panic in her face. That was the other thing he had noticed about her, across 6 weeks of close quarters. That panic was not in her particular repertoire. What she had instead was something colder and more useful. She could be afraid and clear-headed at the same time. "Do you want to go?" he asked. She watched the rider come up the trail. "No," she said. He nodded. He met the man at the edge of the yard, in the open, with his rifle on his shoulder and his hands on it in a way that was not threatening, and also was. The rider pulled up his horse at a distance that told Amos he had some experience with this type of negotiation. "I'm looking for a woman," the man said. "Came through this territory from south of here." "A lot of women in the territory," Amos said. The rider's eyes moved past him to the cabin. Amos let them. There was nothing in the yard that told a story either way. "I've got papers," the rider said. "From her husband." "Her husband," Amos said, as if he were considering the word. "Man file a complaint with someone official?" The rider looked at him. He was evaluating the way men in his line of work evaluate, calculating odds, considering variables. He's authorized me to bring her back, the writer said. Authorization from a man about his wife, Amos said, isn't the same thing as law. A silence. Wind in the cedars. Somewhere up the slope, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. I'd recommend, Amos said, quietly and without emphasis, that you make a different choice about how to spend the next several days. There's nothing here for you. The writer looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the cabin again. Then he looked back at Amos, and Amos looked back at him. And whatever the man calculated in that exchange, it added up to a number he didn't like, because he turned his horse without another word and rode back down the trail the way he'd come. Amos watched him until he was out of sight. Then he went inside. Meredith was standing at the table with her hand flat on the wood, looking at the door. Is he gone? She asked. For now, Amos said. She nodded slowly. He looked at her hand on the table. Then she said, We should write to the federal marshal's office, in Topeka. He looked at her. Preston's been running his land titles through the county office, she said. I saw the papers once. He's been falsifying transfers, 3 different parcels that I know of. If I give names and dates, they'll have grounds to come out. She paused. He'll be occupied with that for a good while. He won't have money or attention to spare for hired men. Amos was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this, he said. I've had 6 weeks, she said. He almost smiled. It was a near thing. I'll ride to Millvale tomorrow, he said. They have a telegraph. She nodded. She took her hand off the table. I'll write it out tonight, she said. I want to make sure I remember it correctly. The letter went to Topeka. The reply came 3 weeks later, forwarded through the Millvale postmaster, who held it with the slightly wide-eyed expression of a man who understood he was involved in something that had teeth. 2 federal deputies arrived in Harrow Bend on a Monday morning in February and spent 4 days going through the county land office records with the focused thoroughness of men who already knew what they were looking for. Preston Hale was arrested on a Thursday. The charges were federal, wire and land fraud, falsification of public documents, and they had the quality, as federal charges do, of being extremely difficult to make disappear. His lawyer was good. It didn't particularly matter. The records were clear. Sheriff Graft, it emerged in the process, had been aware of at least 2 of the transactions. He resigned before the week was out. The town of Harrow Bend elected a new man in the spring. Younger, from out of county, who had not had 15 years of Friday evening whiskey with anyone at all. Meredith learned about all of this in pieces, from letters that came through the Millvale postmaster, and she received each piece with the careful, measured satisfaction of a person who has stopped expecting anything, and so is genuinely surprised by good news. She stayed through the winter. She stayed through the spring, and helped with the planting in the small kitchen garden behind the root cellar, and learned the territory well enough to run the upper trap line alone. In April, a neighbor from 7 miles east, a farming family named Hadley, came by to introduce themselves to what they'd heard was someone new on the ridge, and they stayed for coffee and cornbread, and the wife, a broad, cheerful woman named Dorothy, looked at Meredith and Amos sitting across from each other at the table and said nothing but smiled in a way that contained a great deal of opinion. After they left, Amos cleared the cups, and Meredith watched him from her chair and said, She thinks we're married. Most people will, he said. Does that bother you? She asked. He thought about it. No, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Me neither, she said. It was not a proposal. It was not an answer to a question either of them had asked directly. It was simply 2 people in a small cabin on a hill in Kansas in April, speaking plainly about what was true, the way people speak when they have stopped pretending otherwise. She did not go back to Harrow Bend. There was nothing there for her. No family left in the county, no property in her name, nothing worth the trip. The farm where she'd grown up east of Wichita had been sold after her father died. Her mother had gone to live with a sister in Missouri. The town itself was simply a place that had known what was happening to her for 5 years and had tended to its own business, and she felt no pull toward it, no nostalgia, not even any particular anger anymore. Anger required a kind of ongoing attention that she had better uses for. She wrote to her mother in Missouri. The letter took 2 weeks to arrive and 2 weeks to be answered. And when the reply came back, it was in her mother's familiar cramped hand, and Meredith sat at the table and read it twice, and folded it, and put it in the box with the other things she kept. The following summer she planted a second kitchen garden on the south-facing slope where the light was better, and grew tomatoes and squash and enough dried beans to last a winter without rationing. She got her own mule, a brown and contrary animal that she named Patience, for the quality she required most frequently in its presence, and learned the territory for 10 miles in every direction well enough to move through it with the easy authority of someone who has stopped being a visitor and become something else entirely. She was 28 years old. She had survived 5 years in a locked room and come out the other side into open country, and she had stopped looking at the horizon the way she'd once looked at everything, calculating threat, calculating damage, calculating the distance between herself and the nearest exit. She looked at it now the way she'd perhaps looked at things before any of it had happened, when she'd been a farmer's daughter with nothing to her name but a quick mind and steady hands, and a life that was still entirely in front of her. The way you look at something that belongs to you. She stood on the ridge above the cabin on a morning in late June, and looked out over the cedar hills and the long blue distances of the Kansas sky. And the wind came up from the valley below, and she let it, and she thought of nothing in particular, which was the most valuable thing she had learned to do. Amos came up through the tree line below with the morning's catch, and she heard him before she saw him. The creak of the pack and the particular rhythm of his step on the rocky slope, and she turned and watched him come up out of the cedars into the morning light, and she felt something settle in her chest that she had no precise word for. Not happiness exactly, or not only that, something more like solidity, the sense of a foundation under the feet. He looked up and saw her on the ridge and said nothing, because they were past the point where everything required saying. He raised one hand briefly in greeting, and she raised one back, and he continued toward the cabin, and she stood on the ridge a moment longer, and looked out once more at the wide country spreading south and east all the way to where the sky met the land in that flat line that meant everything and nothing. Then she turned and walked down the hill toward home.